Go ahead and take your time to read this, and then let me know what you think is the conclusion here.
International law is not effective.
Yep. And what is the reasoning for that?
Like, there is no international police force,
Mm-hmm.
and they need to have it to be effective.
Mm-hmm. To qualify as an effective law, as opposed to merely an impressive declaration, a command must be backed up by an effective enforcement mechanism. All right. So it's kind of all premise. Okay. So if something is to be effective, this is probably one that would benefit from you writing it out in terms of conditional logic. So to be an effective law, what do you require?
It needs a command. A command must be backed up by effective enforcement.
Yes. So an effective law needs what?
Enforcement.
Yes. Effective enforcement. That is why societies have police. The power of the police to enforce society's laws makes those laws effective. So it's kind of just restating the same thing. Well, actually, no, it's saying the other way around, right? That if you have, now it's saying if you have effective enforcement, then it makes the law effective. Do you agree with that second one here?
It's invalid because you flip the two.
You flip the two. However, here you can do that because it's the premise.
Okay.
Because it's basically saying, okay, effective laws require EE, and once you have EE, then you have effective laws. So what it's saying is actually there's a biconditional relationship, which is when A is required for B and vice versa. So B requires A and A requires B. So it's actually, this is okay because it's just giving you another premise. So it's saying first, okay, effective laws require enforcement. Then it's saying if you have enforcement, then you have effective laws. So we can actually just write this as one biconditional relationship. But there's currently no international police force, hence international law is not effective law. So there's no police force, therefore
No.
not effective. Yeah, international law is not effective law, right? However, do you think that that is valid? Because it's saying effective laws need effective enforcement, and then it says no police, no effective law. But is that necessarily a good argument?
No, because you can have other parties enforce it.
Yes. And this is, maybe you can classify it in a couple of different fallacies, but what's the first one that comes to mind?
Like, is it the causal? Like, because like if you have this, then this happens. Like, or
Not really, because there's no correlation here, right? I don't see any correlation here.
I gotta work up my fallacies.
Do you remember apples and oranges?
Is that one? There are two things that.
Yeah. So what are the two things that they're comparing? Or what's the other word that I use? Not comparing, but equating. Yeah. So what are the two that they're equating here?
Effective law and effective enforcement.
Not no.
No. Is it?
Yeah. You were right. You were right because you said police forces are not the only way to enforce, right? So what are they equating then? They're equating
the police force with effective enforcement.
Exactly, because they're not the same thing. So you had it, you just didn't have, it's fine. You knew the flaw, but you just didn't have the terminology for it, right? So yes, police force is not the same thing as effective enforcement. You could have enforcement by an international court, for example, potentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but we have to help this argument. So we might have to say something like, actually, police force is the only way to enforce this stuff. That might be actually something that has to be true for this argument to work. Let's see what they go with. So it says, no one obeys a command unless mechanisms exist to compel obedience.
It doesn't say anything about the police force.
Doesn't say anything about the police force. And also think, does this have to be true for the argument to work at all? Does this have to be true that no one obeys a command?
No.
Right? Not necessarily no one, and not necessarily a command. Isn't that way too general? Right? Because we're talking about effective international laws. But now you're talking about no one obeys a command unless mechanisms exist to compel obedience. Are you talking about like toddlers? Are you talking about students? That has you're going way too broad with this, right? So when that happens in the necessary assumption question, if you go way too broad like that, it doesn't have to be true anymore. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Because you don't need the I only need to stay within the scope of what my argument was about, which is laws and enforcement and international law specifically. If you go too broad and you go to no one obeying a command at all, then it's too much. Now you're talking about now you're talking about employees, or you're talking about students, or you're talking about children, you're talking about too much. B says, if an international police force were established, then so-called international law would become effective law. Is B the hidden assumption there? Yeah, I think so, because it's saying, well, if an international police force, well, it's actually, this would translate to if PF, then effective law, right? But we kind of had the opposite here. It said no PF, then no EL. Power of police force makes those laws effective. Actually, power of police to enforce society's laws makes those laws effective. So it does say that actually. So, oh, that's because that's the other one when you go from here to here, right? Because it's bidirectional. Yep. So that might be the one actually, because that is what we're saying here. We're saying effective enforcement leads to effective law, right? Okay. Which is then it's claiming that the police is basically the only way to get there, which is kind of what this one is saying. So I would leave that one then. So yes, could be that one. Let's see, the only difference between international law and the law of an individual society is the former's lack of an effective enforcement mechanism. Does that have to be true? That's the only difference? No. The other difference could be that international law applies to international countries and individual society laws apply just to the citizens in that country. It doesn't, yeah. That could be another difference. It doesn't need to be the only difference. The primary purpose of police force is to enforce the laws of the society. Does it matter what the primary purpose is for us?
I would say yes, because that's their job. Like, the assumption is like you need them to do it. So if they don't do it, so they have to have a purpose.
But do you think they could do it even if it wasn't their primary purpose? Yeah, why not, right? So then does it have to be their primary purpose?
No.
Not necessarily, right? So then we can get rid of that one. Then E says only an international police force could effectively enforce international law. So these two are a little bit similar, but different. What do you think? Only an international police force could effectively enforce international law. Is that the assumption that the person's making? I think it has to be, because it says there is no police, hence there is no effective law. So that means, okay, it is assuming that police is the only way you could do it. I agree. Good. So then let's see what's wrong with B then. So why do you think B is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to be true?
I don't like then so-called. Like,
well, the so-called isn't a big issue, because remember it said what is called
in quotations.
So same thing. It's sticking within the same vein of the argument. So I don't know if that's the issue. So you have to think about, does this have to be true? That if an international police were established, then it would become effective law.
We're not talking about effective law. We're talking about, well, yeah, I guess we are. Hold on. Then so-called international law would become effective law. I don't know.
Well, let me ask you this. Is the editorial assuming that, is it assuming B, that if you had the police force, then it would become effective? Or is it saying that to be effective, you need the police force?
It's more of an assumption. Well, if you have this, like the other one is more direct. So that one is like the more like you need this to have this. And then
that's what E is doing, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's why B is a little bit backwards, because the editorial is assuming, okay, if you want to be effective, you need that police force. But it's not saying if you have that police force, now it's automatically effective. And think about it, right? Because what makes an effective law? Is it just having police?
No.
No, you need a bunch of other stuff. You need courts. You need effective policymakers. You need a bunch of stuff, right? So you need a bunch of stuff for something to be effective, not just police. And also, more importantly, that's not what the editorial said, right? Because we want to try not to use our outside knowledge. But if our outside knowledge is congruent with what the argument is saying, then it's useful. right?
Mhm.
So the editorial said, you know, you need police to have effective law, but not the opposite. That you need, as soon as you have police, that you'll have an effective law. Yeah. Okay, good. I think you're picking it up pretty well. I think you're getting the answers much more, like you said,